Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 8 for season 5. My name is Lee. I'm in Western Australia. It's just me and Zeev tonight. He's in Melbourne.
G'day. So I
And
am.
yes, and so you are. We're going to talk about two topics. We're going to talk about some proposed national security legislation that has some very troubling implications. We're also going to talk about kind of Victorian shenanigans. Basically, the Victorian government wants to regulate labour hire companies in such a way as to effectively force them to unionise. And it's just some really nasty stuff there. So, first off, let's talk about a very troubling piece of legislation currently being considered by the government. I think there's an inquiry at the moment. It's called the National Security Legislation Amendment, brackets, Espionage and Foreign Interference Bill 2017. So there is... this is probably, there's stuff to do with charities as well, but there's a few things that were brought up by the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. They did a submission that kind of talks about some of the provisions, and it's got some very broad implications, including essentially more or less banning the spread of any information that the government doesn't want to get spread. So it essentially criminalizes it. Previously, from discussions I had with people who sort of know some of this stuff, basically it was previously only those who handled secret information couldn't distribute it. Now it's anybody who it's given to. So, if somebody, a contractor, a Edward Snowden type situation, a contractor gets some information and leaks it to the media would actually the journalists involved would get in trouble.
Under the new laws.
Under the new laws, yes. So that's one aspect.
New proposed laws.
It's just, it does get, it has some provisions for... if you're a journalist, but it's very, very vague, and it gives the government a lot of discretion to decide when and how it thinks it wants to do these things. It gets to define, causing harm to Australia's interests. There's a number of aspects to it.
Absolutely, Lee. And what seems to have happened as a result of that is that off the back of that submission and public pressure to change the bill, which is, it's only a proposal at the moment, a draft bill, the government has redefined the legislation, or the proposed legislation, I should say, somewhat. And in effect, what it does now, and there's a reasonable article in The Guardian, insert boos and hisses here for The Guardian now, but...
Hey, they're reporting and stuff, so, they did, fair,
absolutely.
There might be lefty jokes on a bunch of issues, but on this stuff, they are good.
Yeah, they've done some great stuff, The Guardian. I'm only kidding around. We love you, The Guardian. Now, the point is that they've done some good work on this national security laws, and they point out now that if a journalist reasonably believed that they were disclosing the material in the public interest, they now can disclose that. As long as they prove that they've reasonably believed that, they can now disclose that material. I guess that's a stronger defence, so to speak, for the disclosure of otherwise classified or confidential material in a journalist's possession. And I guess the key difficulty with that, of course, is that it leaves it to law enforcement officials, the judiciary, the judges, the government, basically, to decide when it isn't in the public interest or reasonable to believe that it's in the public interest to disclose material. And actually, that's a highly controversial topic. As we've seen from the Edward Snowden debate overseas, as we've seen from other leakers overseas, the fact of the matter is that government officials will naturally take the view that any disclosure is unwarranted, unreasonable, illegitimate, and deserving of punishment. whether or not this defence exists, in a sense, doesn't matter, because the mere threat that this legislation could apply to a disclosure by a journalist is a massive disincentive, if you will. It's a massive blow to freedom of speech, because every journalist that knows that they are writing or publishing an article under the possible threat of criminal charges, of a trial that could take years, that could bankrupt their financials, bankrupt them financially, or their media organisation, question mark if the media organisation will support them that far. I mean, who would want to operate on those conditions? Now, I'm not saying that no journalist will ever publish an article again after these laws are passed. That's clearly not the case. I am saying, though, that people assess risk, and they can look at this legislation and perhaps think twice before they disclose material that is embarrassing to the government of the day, even if it doesn't actually endanger anyone to disclose it.
That's it.
So,
I mean, you think about what happened with Edward Snowden. You know, he handed this information off to Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian, and then essentially went to, I think he met them in Hong Kong, and then basically went straight to Russia, because, and he's but more or less probably going to have to spend the rest of his life living in Russia, just because,
in exile.
In exile, because he did a incredibly courageous thing in letting the public know what the government was up to. Now, if that's what journalists are going to have to think about, like, do I want to live in exile for standing up for what I know to be true? You know, it's going to make them reconsider. Ooh.
It's a tough ask. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
It's a very tough ask to ask them to do that. Absolutely. And there's other problems with the bill that I've looked at briefly, and I can say this. I mean, there's a definition of infrastructure and sabotaging infrastructure in this bill that is so incredibly broad. I mean, sabotaging public infrastructure is basically sabotaging almost any information held by a company.
Yes.
And that's extraordinary, because that's not public first of all, by any stretch of the imagination, because anything that a company owns is privately owned.
Yep.
And second of all, because how would sabotaging that at all prejudice anyone? And why should it involve a penalty of, up to 10 years imprisonment just because it's a sabotage of public infrastructure? Now, we can debate whether destroying property of any kind, what the appropriate punishment should be, but it just seems too broad and too much like an exercise in security theatre to introduce all these provisions about treachery and sabotage and interference with a democratic or political right or duty. That's another one.
Was another one.
Which could be that could be anything. Government's under a duty to discharge the law, and people have all manner of political rights. I mean, to interfere with them and be up to 10 years imprisonment. I mean, oh yes, but to go on to the sabotage.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring up two aspects of so it essentially brings in this term of, which you mentioned, public infrastructure. Which, I mean, when you think, okay, bridges and, like, military bases and stuff like that. So there's two clauses in this, the description of it, and it includes the two really broad ones are any infrastructure, facility, premises, network, or electronic system that belongs to the Commonwealth. So if you smash the windows of a government building, that's damage to the public infrastructure. And anything damage that belongs or is operated by a constitutional corporation or is used to facilitate constitutional trade or commerce. I mean, so basically every single, if you smash Westpanc's windows, possible. I mean,
or if a guy owns a truck going from Sydney to Melbourne, and on that journey you smash the truck. It's just a random truck. Well, that truck is engaged in interstate trade and commerce. It's going from Melbourne to Sydney delivering goods.
And it's operated by a constitutional corporation.
Well, so, it doesn't even have to be.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, I mean, my thought is this is going to be used against anti-coal activists.
Sorry. It could be.
That's one of that's what I initially thought. Zeev just dropped his microphone for those on the podcast.
My apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is this could potentially be used against anti-Adani protesters because oh, that's right, because there's another aspect which is any infrastructure, facility, premises, network, or electronic system, including information that provides or relates to the public with utilities or services, including transport of goods of people or goods of any kind.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
if you
it's
tie yourself to a coal train,
yeah.
that's a breach of this thing, and there's very stiff penalties. And so the thing is not even so much that the government's going to use this willy nilly. Because I mean, if they went crazy doing this all the time, I think people would get up in arms. But the thing is, it's the threat. And I mean, you probably even know better than I have. But if you look at the use of lengthy prison terms in the US in particular to get plea bargains, they come in and say, if you go to trial, we're going to throw at you a 50-year sentence, or you can take 2 years right now if you plead guilty. Those are the kinds of systems where it gives government a lot of power. So, you get busted for protesting Adani. I think you and I both agree that those are dumb hippies.
Yeah.
We don't like necessarily what they're doing. But, a federal prosecutor comes along and says, well, if you don't accept this lesser charge, I'll charge you with, potentially 10 years in prison or whatever it is for like recklessly endangering sabotage or whatever it is.
There is certainly some scope for that in this legislation to just throw the proverbial book at people for something that's totally disproportionate to what they've done, particularly because the definitions are so broad.
Yep.
And what I would add to that as well is that, in a sense, the whole proposal is apart from the dangerous overreach, is about security theatre.
Yes.
It's about giving people the impression that the government is doing something about national security, as if passing more laws would really make us more secure. But the fact of the matter is that, criminal conduct has been, threats to life, liberty, or property, whether it be of an individual or a government agency, has been legal, for hundreds of years. And the fact of the matter is that we have the laws there. They've been around for yonks, and every single time there's a new media release about new laws, I sit in wonderment that anyone can look at this as anything other than just a pantomime for the tabloid media to eat up. And people think, well, now they're finally doing something, as if, and then in another 5-10 years we'll see more of it, and because apparently the last tranche of laws just didn't do the trick. I don't know. Anyway.
I mean, I'd be interested to know how much they've added to national security legislation since 9/11. I imagine it's probably in the almost dozens of times that they've added more offences. I mean, so let's talk about the interference with political rights and duties. This is section 83.4, I'm guessing. So a person commits an offence if the person engages in conduct. The conduct involves the use of force or violence or intimidation or making of threats of any kind. The conduct results in interference with the exercise or performance in Australia of any other person of an Australian democratic right, or political right or duty, and the duty or right arises under the Constitution or of a law of the Commonwealth. So, yeah.
I mean, the Commonwealth has a lot of duties. Practically every government agency has a duty to discharge the legal functions which it was created to do. People have a duty to vote, or a right to vote. Yep. So I don't know, it's a minor tiff at a voting booth or something between two people might intimidate onlookers. Maybe it's a personal issue between them, but that could be it. Is it just making a nuisance of yourself with some local bureaucrat or agency? I don't know.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think that Part D, the right or duty arises under the Constitution. Okay, that might make sense. But, or a law of the Commonwealth. Yeah. So that's real. There's a lot of legislation that it provides for duties. And how much of it, it doesn't exactly spell out what is a political duty
Yeah,
the
it's
legislation I'm
very,
aware of.
very open-ended.
So if I don't know, if you trip up a government official on the way to work, maybe they're on the way, like a treasury official, is
Yeah.
that an offence? Could you go to prison for 10 years for or like union protests?
Mm.
I mean, say the unions blockade a government building,
Mm.
are they all potentially found guilty under this for 10 years prison? I mean, it's
I think that the people who drafted this section were maybe they had in mind this kind of Australiano of the voting booth and some I don't know someone breaking into the voting booth and intimidating people or I don't know what they had in mind, but even that's already an offence.
yeah.
I mean, I just don't understand it. It's just this kind of protecting Australiana and this idea of, Australian democracy being under threat. And, well, let's just chuck a section in there about threatening Australian democracy in the most open-ended way possible so that people can, in some way, think that we're protecting Australian democracy, whatever that means. It's just, I don't know what they're on about. And anyway.
I mean, I think it seems from just sort of reading it that they want to cast the widest possible net, so that when something bad happens, they've got some sort of recourse. If they see a situation that's not, maybe they don't feel is currently covered, they've kind of got some backup. Unfortunately, one of the issues for us as libertarians is we believe that you shouldn't create laws that you can't trust bad people to implement. So all of this, I mean, if this legislation passes, I suspect we're not going to sort of fall under some sort of, fascist dictatorship overnight. But you have to ask the question, how could this legislation be used in the future by either an official who has no accountability, somebody who's just like no one's paying attention to, who's just wrecking the lives of individuals and it's not being picked up in the media, or if it gets used in a systemic way. So yeah, I think it's really just done by probably well-intentioned people who probably, I mean, I suspect there's a lot of internal scare, almost sort of scaremongering, or like government officials scaring themselves. I mean, they see a lot of
pretty much
information that would probably suggest there's way more threats than we would think. The problem is there's no one critiquing those threats, I would imagine. There's no one who, it's not like they expose this information to the public so we can judge whether the government is sufficiently scared or not. They just say, we're scared. There's all this scary stuff we can't tell you about.
Yeah.
And so they could just be scaring themselves into believing that this is what's necessary to do to secure, to secure the country. Yeah. Go.
Final thoughts you're about to say.
That's what I was going to ask.
Final thoughts is this is all just security theatre. I've said it before and I'll repeat it again. It's pointless security theatre. Hopefully it doesn't harm anyone, but the Commonwealth is passing so many new offences every day that I think it's impossible to keep track of them all. And who knows? How can anyone hope to knowingly obey all the laws of this land? I don't know.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, in a pressing way, I think the stuff to do with the secrecy and the information that journalists handle, that's something that's like really relevant. Like, I mean, some of the other stuff is probably going to be obscure offences that maybe people get threatened with or maybe not. But this stuff to do with leaks is the real deal. And that's actually scary for the state of accountability for the government. Especially if they have the essentially carte blanche to decide what is and is not acceptable to be discussed in public. So what I'll do is I'll put a link to the MEAA's submission. So if you want to have a read of it, anybody, you can do so. Let's talk about... I'm sorry, but one final thought, actually. Why the restriction only journalists get to disseminate information? What is a journalist if not just anyone and everyone allowing everyone and everyone to disseminate information? If it's right for a journalist, why not for everyone else? Why are they a special class of people? They shouldn't be. Anyway. Yeah. Also, I mean, and a journalist... what is it? A person's capacity as a journalist engaged in fair and accurate reporting, and the submission says, Yeah.
In
Anyway,
fairness, that's no longer the case. They've loosened that to a reasonable public belief,
right. Okay. Oh,
reasonable
that's all
belief
right.
in the public interest, which
Okay.
is a little. Again, it still threatens litigation. But
Yes.
moving
Yep.
on now. Yeah.
So yes, the Andrews government is currently sort of really heavily pushing a bill through the Victorian upper house. It's already been passed in the lower house. They're trying to get it through the upper house. This is brought to my attention, well, from an article you shared. It was an op-ed in the Australian, so I'll make sure I post a link to that. Essentially, it illustrates. So they're trying to regulate labour hire companies. So there was an
License them.
Yeah, and license them. This is apparently got to do with a Four Corners expose that sort of showed like farm labour that was sort of being poorly treated by the labour hire companies, and I think it was like backpackers. So the problem is essentially, and this is what the article suggests, is that it could include almost any company. So it would include, like big accounting firms like KPMG and, PwC, Deloitte, and so it's, because they're consultancy firms. Also potentially like sort of electrical contracting companies, because the key aspect is it talks about. So the legislation says. Essentially, you would be covered by this legislation if you supply one or more individuals to another person to perform work in and as part of a business or undertaking of the host. So,
in other words, these are contractors. I mean,
yes.
a labour hire organisation employs people and then contracts that labour out to someone else.
Yep.
And the danger is that if those people are licensed, the legislation that the Victorian government is putting forward would allow any person, including a union, to complain that the terms of the license have been breached. For example, that the employer is doing something dodgy, allegedly. Now, if you create that scenario that any person can complain and therefore have their license revoked, just on the back of one complaint, potentially, then you've put the employer organisation in an incredibly vulnerable position. Their entire business could fall apart or is threatened by it, basically
Also
off the back of one
as well.
complaint.
That's what.
Pardon?
So it's the people who can complain are also competitors. So
Yes.
one aspect that I think libertarians have highlighted in particular is how the use of licensing, where the licensing board is run by the businesses who are being licensed, and they can have the discretion to say, well, no, we're not going to offer a license to anybody who wants to come into the market. Now, this isn't quite the same. This is sort of, you get the license and then 3 years down the track, because it's only a 3-year license, they can have complaints against you to try and shut you down. And one of the things the article points out is, as soon as the license is cancelled, that is it. So if you're talking about like large labour hire companies, which he highlights, I think there's about 6 or 70 mentions. But also, like Deloitte, PwC, and KPMG are like massive companies. These are not like small firms who can afford to just sort of dip their toe in the water a bit and have, when they get burned by the government, to sort of just pull out. Like they're not going to want to deal with this kind of instability in the market.
Absolutely. It's an impossible way to run your business, run your business under the threat of a complaint that could ruin it in a heartbeat by your competitor or by a union. I think that's an incredible thing. And another point to mention, of course, is that while this is happening, there are similar laws actually being passed in South Australia. And I don't know if they go quite as far as the laws that Robert Gottliebson has put forward here. But according to an ABC report back in November of last year, similar laws have already been passed in Queensland.
Yep.
And also there are new South Australian laws that are being put forward, and if the Labor Party wins the next election in South Australia, they could be passed there as well. So I guess the the question then is, I mean, if these laws are passed, I mean, labour hire companies will be hit, which in a way is, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of a labour union, that's good news, because labour unions want people to be enrolled under permanent employment with one particular employer, being a specific company entrenched in an industry. If the employees are shifting from workplace to workplace, if they don't have that permanence and they don't have that, how shall I put it, bargaining power against that particular employer, if things go astray. Labour hire companies undermine union business models. So you can see why, in a sense, this kind of legislation makes sense as a way of undermining labour hire nationally. Indeed, I know that.
I think the concern Robert Gottliebson brings up is actually that the unions will use this as leverage to get support from labour hire companies. So they'll say, if we won't complain if you choose to unionise with us. Which, I mean, we see that as an aspect of all sorts of industrial relations where, like the use of strikes, the use of go slow, all sorts of stuff. It's like, if you do not play ball with us, if you do not give us what we want, we will make your life hell. And in Victoria, they've seen that with what was it? Borrell was involved. I can't remember who it was, but there was a blockade in the city of a particular work site. I can't remember for the life of me what it is.
Could have been Borrell, but go on.
Borrell was involved
in Victoria.
In Victoria,
that's one of them.
So basically,
I mean, there's been a few, and Borrell's been the victim of one.
Yeah. Basically, it will come to me later. I'll try and look it up. But essentially, they blockaded the work site, so the CFMEU. They blockaded the work site. They wouldn't let anybody in. The Supreme Court said it's an illegal blockade. Yeah. The cops didn't do anything about it. And it was just a nightmare.
And it was ignored. It was ignored, and eventually, I believe it was Borrell, they managed to get a damages payout against the CFMEU, and I can't remember the figure, but other than that, I mean, the police didn't enforce it, as you say. Go on.
I'm just looking up this thing. I need to know what it is. It's driving me crazy. And I mean, that's GrowCon. That's it, GrowCon. So the Borrell got involved because essentially the dispute boiled over. It was like a secondary boycott and targeted whatnot to Borrell. I mean, there's already big issues with the use of coercion by unions to force companies to submit to them and to do what they say, or they'll cause trouble. I mean, this is even worse. I mean, GrowCon, I think, tried to stick it out. They lost money, but they kept going. But the government will destroy your business overnight by revoking your license, and competitors and unions can use that, use that power to target you. So it's just, I mean, it's a real mess. Now we've got a couple of minutes left, so maybe what would be like the libertarian alternatives? So, discovered that there's, farmers and labour hire companies are screwing workers, migrant workers. What would what would be your solution as a libertarian to this sort of problem?
My goodness. Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so I mean, it's easy for us to criticize. I mean, leaving aside the possibility that this is actually just doing the union's, like the bidding, and they're trying to get favour with the union because it's the Labor Party after all. Assume that this is well-intentioned. Say they're really trying to solve this problem of dodgy labour hire companies colluding with ruthless employers to screw over migrant farm labour. How do we as libertarians do we resolve that? Because it clearly is, that is a problem within the market. We would say the government shouldn't fix this necessarily, or that there's other things. I guess. What are some of those other things?
I think the point to make is that underpaying workers, avoiding tax, and avoiding workers' compensation and superannuation payments. I mean, these are all allegations, first of all. And I guess the first point to mention is that allegations against specific businesses, if they've done wrong, should be tested, if they've allegedly done wrong, should be tested against those specific businesses rather than against the industry as a whole. To say that the industry as a whole should be punished for the alleged wrongdoings of one particular company or two or however many it may be is collective punishment. And that's inappropriate. The next point to mention is that typically companies underpay, so to speak, when they're going broke. That's when it really happens. And we need to ask ourselves, well, if we didn't have a bunch of regulations that undermined free enterprise in this country, I think fewer companies would be going broke quite so quickly. I think if tax rates were lower, you'd find more companies paying the tax that they were required to pay. I mean, leaving aside the debate about whether, the radical thing about whether people should pay tax, I think people would comply with the law if the law was simpler. And again, in terms of underpaying workers, I think typically that allegation is because of what debates over the modern awards that employers are required to pay, which again, I mean, first of all, those are riven with red tape. Like some modern awards are impossible to understand without a lawyer. Second of all, that's a problem in itself. Of compliance, as I've already pointed out. And the solution is to make these laws simpler and easier to comply with, or to get rid of them entirely, rather than to blame contractors and hire companies for failing to comply with laws that perhaps shouldn't exist in the first place. But it's a very complex argument that really we're raising, or I'm raising here, really, about the whole system that they're functioning under, and saying, well, is the system as a whole right?
Yeah, I mean, one other aspect is which ties into what you're talking about, which is kind of the complexity of legislation is immigration law. So the nature, I mean, this is obviously not something that the Victorian government can sort out because it's obviously a federal thing, but migrants if you're a migrant who's given a visa to work in a certain area, well, then you're kind of over a barrel if the labour hire company says these are the conditions under which we employ you. So I mean, and
the solution there is to say, well, shouldn't we relax our migration laws so that people can just come and go as they please to get work, and then that kind of abuse won't be able, and then exactly relax our visas so that people can just, which they used to do, by the way, to a greater extent than they do now. People could just say, oh, I have a particular skill, so I'm migrating, rather than, oh, I have a particular employer, so I'm coming here. And that second provision has created a lot of room for abuse. Not just by employers, I should say, but also for migration agents who now tell would-be migrants, oh, if you come over here, I'll find you a job, and then they never do, but pay me a bunch of fees, and anyway. So, not an ideal scenario.
Indeed. All right, well, we'll leave it at that because I think we've definitely covered the topic. So, thanks to everybody for joining us. Make sure you can like and share and subscribe to us on YouTube or on iTunes, and we've got a Facebook page. So feel free to like our page and share our content. And we'll be back again next week.
Thank you.